at all you lovely people. Thank you so much. And it is so extremely lovely to be in Scotland. And I just wish I was staying. You're laughing. I mean it. And I wish I was staying longer. I'll be back.
We're laughing. We're not used to hearing positive things about our own country at the moment. So
Oh,
we're slightly in shock, aren't we?
Oh, there's lots to love about Scotland. First of all, it's not England.
That's the big one.
I have an Irish passport, and so, I have my feelings. And of course, I also love your votes on Brexit, and I love your electrification and your renewables. And actually, in the States, I'm always saying, like, if Scotland can go 100% electric, what the fuck is up with the rest of you?
Thank you.
You're welcome.
You.
Or 100% renewable, but...
Thank you.
I digress.
Welcome, everyone, to this very, very special evening. This is so exciting. My name is Chitra Ramaswamy, and I'm an author and journalist, and it is my great privilege and joy to be in conversation with Rebecca Solnit this evening. I think we should give her another round of applause. So Rebecca Solnit is one of our foremost writers, activists, intellectuals, historians, and humans, as far as I'm concerned. She has written more than 20 books spanning many, many decades and covering subjects as wide-ranging as the climate catastrophe, gender-based violence, feminism, history, memory, politics, walking, getting lost, roses, apricots. I could go on. I think those of us who love her work and have done so for a long time, for me anyway, it's something about Rebecca's capacity for synthesis and the marriage of form and content in her work. I think as a writer, she's completely unparalleled in her ability to sort of mean what she says and say what she means and do it with the most exquisitely beautiful sentences. We're going to be discussing Rebecca's two most recent books this evening, Recollections of My Non-Existence, which is both a memoir and a kind of anti-memoir, a little like one of her earlier books, The Faraway Nearby, that's about the sort of formation of her voice and herself, but also the world that both kind of has made her and at times that threatened to unmake or maybe even break her. And also Orwell's Roses, which is a biography of George Orwell, a biography of roses, a biography of George Orwell planting roses, and a lot more than that as well. And both of these books, interestingly, I read them back to back, and it occurred to me that they're both about foundational moments in the lives of a writer, Orwell in Orwell's Roses, and then Rebecca Solnit in Recollections. And it occurred to me then that I encountered you, Rebecca, in my own formative period when I was in my 20s, and I was a young journalist, a young idealistic journalist working at the Big Issue in Glasgow, and this writer called Rebecca Solnit came to Borders, some of you will remember the bookshop on Buchanan Street that no longer exists, obviously, and I went along and I heard her talk and I read the book, and it completely blew me away, and I don't think I could have articulated then quite what reading her did for me, but there is a passage in Recollections where you talk, Rebecca, about some of your concern, your project over decades as being a kind of naming of the obstacles that women in particular face, in the hope that perhaps the young women who have come after you can, if not avoid them altogether, at least have language and be able to name them too. And I suppose I wanted to take this opportunity to say your project was a success, because I am one of those women, and your words set me free, and I think the fact that I'm sitting here in conversation with you now is a kind of testament to that. So thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
And I think I speak on behalf of everyone here that, you know, on this day in particular, I'm sure everyone's followed the news this afternoon, that we are sitting here in your company this evening on this terrible occasion where Roe v. Wade has been overturned, as I know you knew it probably would be. It's so devastating, so perhaps unsurprising, but shocking nonetheless. And I can't think of anything better than being in your company this evening.
Thank you. Thank you. We knew it was coming. There's a phrase I think you in the UK could use as much as we in the US, all these things that are shocking but not surprising, where, you know, it should never have happened, and so there's a kind of moral outrage, but it's not that you didn't think it could happen. You know, the naivete has been shattered by, you know, crimes and lies and all the rest. But it is a horrific day, and a day that will live in infamy, as Franklin Delano Roosevelt said about Pearl Harbor. And a lot more people will die of this than died in Pearl Harbor. And about half the women in the US may immediately lose their reproductive rights. And it's not even going back to before Roe versus Wade. They're now trying to criminalize women for having miscarriages and demanding a kind of totalitarian scrutiny of reproductive lives. And one of the things people are tweeting is delete your menstrual apps, because, you know, if you're charting, and of course, thank you Silicon Valley, which has overtaken my hometown of San Francisco, you know, has sort of sold all our privacy for profit. Speaking of Orwellian, you know, so many people use menstrual apps, for example, where they're charting their cycle in a way that's accessible to corporations and possibly to the government, who, if they decide that they want to find out if you're pregnant, if you did anything about that pregnancy. But they're also criminalizing, even in California, my state, in a conservative area, they tried to charge a woman who had a stillborn baby with murder. And, you know, there are if you look at all the times women don't even know they're pregnant because the miscarriage happened so early, if you look at all the eventualities, even without abortion, about half of all pregnancies do not result in live births. And so many things can go wrong for the mother and the child. And so essentially, you know, Recollections of My Non-Existence is in part about all the ways that women are erased, not allowed to participate, punished for showing up, told that they don't matter, that they don't have full human status. And this essentially places the rights of of two cells that can only be seen under a microscope over living, breathing, speaking human beings. And you know, and it's a complete nightmare. And my main hope is that it will so galvanize people to fully participate that we will defeat them in the November elections, take back the Senate, because the House, which is dominated by Democrats led by Nancy Pelosi, a devout Catholic and abortion defender, and my representative, already passed an abortion rights bill in September, and if we take the Senate, we can finish the job and fuck the Supreme Court, which is an utterly illegitimate court. But we are in a time where women's, you know, I was talking to Chitra as we're walking in this lovely rain that has broken the heat, and which was what I was expecting all day, and according to the weather reports. But you know, I was saying that there's been a lot lately about how, like, feminism is collapsing or defeated or whatever, and there have been some terrible things in the last few years in the US in particular. But Ireland, Argentina, Mexico have legalized abortion, which is stunning in those Catholic countries. And you know, if I look at the last half century and more of feminism, the status of women 60 years ago was so unbelievably bad, so institutionally unequal under the law and in all customs, etc., with women having so little access to all the corridors of power, so little space in which to, you know, have the right to bodily autonomy, self-determination. marriage in most parts of the world was essentially an ownership contract in which women surrendered their rights over their property, their bodies, and everything else to husbands. There's a very funny moment where, um, oh gosh, Ms. Magazine founder at somebody shouted out. Why am I forgetting her? Exactly, was interviewed by by somebody who's like, well, you didn't get married till your 60s, and Gloria Steinem said, first I had to reinvent the institution of marriage. The terrifying thing about the Supreme Court is that Clarence Thomas, one of our illegitimate justices, has said this clears the way to overturn the right to birth control, the right to sex with somebody of your own gender, and marriage equality. They're coming after all of it, which I hope will build the majority coalition, which will destroy them. They know that they are the enemies of democracy because they are a minority attempting to wrest control from the majority. And so defending democracy in every way as equal participation, equal rights, voting rights is all part of what we have to do. But enough about America. I wrote a book about a guy named Eric Blair, and who ended up on the Isle of Jura, and
yes,
was also a
that Eric
champion of
Blair.
human rights and had some other interesting things to say.
You did
But
indeed.
yeah.
But if we could stay with recollections for just a minute longer first, because it occurred to me, with the devastating result today, that you talk you first in Men Explain Things to me about these kind of categories of oppression, really. That women are subject to, and you talk about the sort of erosion of credibility, audibility, and consequence. And I was thinking, those all apply to today's ruling, don't they?
They do,
Particularly consequence, in a way, the sense of women simply not mattering.
Not having the right to make decisions, to have jurisdiction over our own bodies, and the fact that reproductive coercion, stealthing, and other ways in which men, not only by what's officially recognized as rape, but that a lot of pregnancies are essentially involuntary. About 13%, in America, according to one source, is part of, women should absolutely have reproductive rights for, inherently. But the fact that pregnancy is often involuntary is part of why it absolutely has to be a choice.
And in many ways, Rebecca, recollections of my non-existence, I kind of saw it as a sort of a biography of the emergence of a voice.
Yeah.
Or rather the story of how a voice kind of makes itself, a woman's voice, your voice. And it all really begins in this apartment on Lion Street in San Francisco. So I wondered whether you could kind of take us all back there and talk to us about that kind of foundational moment in this building, but kind of where you built yourself.
The wonderful Mr. Young.
I love Mr. Young.
Thank you. I loved him too.
What is it? He says to you something like, "If you want it, you should have it." It's like the best thing.
I know, which is like all we all want everyone to say to us all the time. And sometimes when you're small, your mother actually does. And sometimes it's not good for you, but so my parents kind of cut me off when I was 17. I was tremendously poor. I'd been living in a kind of flop house, SRO, single residency occupancy, like a long-term hotel sort of situation with no kitchen, etc. Is quite bleak. And set out to find an apartment I could afford at 19. And this stunningly beautiful place had been advertised. This is, long before the internet, long before home computers, or actually just before home computers. But, just tiny newspaper ad. Didn't know I was going into a black neighborhood. Didn't really know much about anything. But it was the most stunningly beautiful apartment. Top floor in a 3-story, you would call it a 2-story building, because you guys have ground floors, which we call first floors. I'm bilingual, and up to a point. And so the building manager, who's a big black man wearing overalls, welcomed me in, sent me up to look at it. Had two East Bay windows and a South Bay window, oak floors, built in the 1920s with some very sweet details, painted white, and just absolutely luminous. And I just felt I just fell in love with it. I had never dreamed I could have something so nice. So I went down, and he said, I told him I wanted it, and he said, well, if you want it, you should have it. And then he handed me the application, and it was a company that had already rejected me. It's that young person's thing that, until you make enough money, you can't have things. You can't have things until, the feedback loop, like you can't get hired until you have experience. You can't have experience unless someone will hire you. And so he said this wonderful conspiratorial thing that I think was about being black and knowing what it's like to be on the outside. He said, get some respectable middle-aged lady to fill out the form for you, and I'll never tell anybody, I'll never tell nobody no different. And so, so I got the apartment, little realizing I would live there from 19 till 45. And through 9 years of friendship with Mr. Young, who died of prostate cancer in 1988. And it's a funny thing about the book, and it's very much about waking up to the fact that huge numbers of men wanted to harm me, not because of anything specific to me, but because I was just in that category of a young woman, and that nobody in the culture at that moment, or very few people outside, feminists who seemed to be way over there, very far from where I was, kind of imaginatively, psychically, politically, or apolitically at that moment, nobody had anything to say about it. So I wrote a book that's partly about, all these men threatening and harassing me. The desk that I've written, every book I've ever written on, at least in part, was given to me as I moved into that apartment by a friend a man had tried to murder for daring to leave him. He had stabbed her 15 times, and through a miraculous intervention, she didn't bleed to death. And then everyone, because this was the beginning of the 80s, blamed her for it and shamed her for it. And the fact that everything I've ever written was on that desk. But the book does have a hero, and it's this man who grew up as a sharecropper's son in Oklahoma, knew Bonnie and Clyde as a child, because the one place in a segregated society they don't look for white outlaws is in the black community, was a World War II veteran, and was this great patron of my literature. So the desk given to me by the woman who almost died for trying to, have self-determination, and this man who gave me the home in which that desk was for 25 years, are kind of two of the heroes of that book. The woman, who I don't name and identify for her by her preference, but Mr. Young, in this book in which there are so many terrible men, is its hero.
Absolutely. And I kind of got the feeling that it was, you were the first white woman to be in that building for,
17 years.
17 years. And it was a completely black neighborhood. And it strikes me that your kind of consciousness of your awareness of race and racism must have been so formed in that period, really, because of course by the time you left it had become gentrified. It was a middle class white area. And that really struck me as, that's what it took. You lived there with these people for a very important period of your life, and the period in which you became a writer.
My otherwise terribly complicated mother was a wonderful anti-racist. I remember sitting in the back of her station wagon while she was driving around doing fair housing work with black families in our conservative town that I grew up in, but I hadn't grown up around a lot of people of color. And then the city of San Francisco itself was a huge part of my education. It's been a non-white majority city long before I moved there. I grew up just north of there. Has huge Asian and Latino populations. It's shrinking black population because of gentrification. California is now a non-white majority state, which is one of the many lovely things about it. And it will never vote for Republicans statewide again, so far as I can tell, which is one of the benefits of a non-white majority state. And but I learned also, and then when I was, God, how old would I have been? Just turning 30, I joined a Native American land rights movement led by two extraordinary Western Shoshone matriarchs, and I had a bunch of experiences, a lot of which were not specifically literary, but living in a black neighborhood, joining a Native land rights struggle, the anti-nuclear movement, where I say the Nevada test site taught me how to write, the city itself, these things that I think places can love you back, they can protect you, they can educate you, they can transform you, and do. And so it's also very much about the place, and gay men were such a huge part of my education. I thought for years and years I'd write an essay just called "Thank You, Gay Men," and because
you kind of have, actually,
and so it became a section of the book.
Yeah.
And now I know as many queer and lesbian and trans and, and other kinds of queer people. But in my youth, gay men were such a wonderful presence, proving to me also there's nothing inherent in, the XY chromosome. It's just patriarchy, which is changeable, unlike XY chromosomes. And, and who were such, such joyous, courageous, inspiring figures. But it's also the decade of the AIDS crisis.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's also, I lived, a 15-minute walk from the Castro, which was the Western epicenter of both the crisis and the organizing against it. I think it's in the acknowledgments that one of the great things coming of being a San Franciscan is being befriended by Cleve Jones, Harvey Milk's right-hand man, and homophobes everywhere get to fly into San Francisco and land into the Harvey Milk terminal, and have a bunch of rainbow flags waved at them. And as Pride Weekend approaches, and so all those things were kind of wonderful factors, getting out of the relative homogeneity, in that era before feminism had done much, where gay people were mostly still, for survival reasons, invisible, etc., into this kind of wonderful city at its best that felt like there was room for everybody.
Mm. And you also write so movingly about this period. You've already talked a little bit about the desk on which you produced all these hundreds of thousands of words. The sort of the origin story of this desk is about violence and gender-based violence. But it struck me as so powerful reading this book that the very period in which you were most kind of under assault, really, under daily assault by men, was also the period in which your voice, your writer's voice, emerged. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about that sort of paradox, about when you were experiencing the most amount of, fear and anxiety and stress, all the stuff that's associated really with being a young woman, the day-to-day life of a young woman going about her business, was also when you sat down at that desk and found your voice.
Yeah, and I feel the book is really two stories, kind of twisted together into, the narrative. One is a very specific story of trying to become a specific thing, a writer, and the other is of being what half the world is, a woman. The condition of voicelessness is inflicted upon women by societies. And I kind of hate the word voicelessness, which suggests that we don't have voices. We need a term like listeningness, listeninglessness. The refusal of people to allow women's voices to be heard, to discredit them when they speak up, as we still see in the news every day, to treat us as incapable of speech and so many ways. And so I really struggled, and as a woman, in so many ways, to have people listen to me just about this, he did this happened. And one of the things that was important to me, because we often think that's very specific to gender violence or something, but some of the stories I tell are about when I was, the first two presses I was at, my first two books, I had really pretty horrific experiences with people treating me as incapable of bearing witness to reality. And I was like, you fuckwads, you're publishing my history book, which you should assume I'm capable of, interviewing, doing research, putting words together in a way that makes sense. And now I'm telling you something, and you cannot believe that it is true because it is inconvenient. And so I constantly had that experience.
Oh, men literally tried to sabotage your career in those early years.
Repeatedly, and and a lot of them, or not a lot, but a lot, at a number of crucial moments, particularly with my first few books, men one man actually threatened a libel suit based on false premises unless we destroyed every copy of my first book. And my publisher seemed to believe that he was right because he was a very formidable old man and I was a very young woman. And I did what I often do. I call myself a data hurler. He claimed, essentially he had borrowed a painting from somebody to show to a potential purchaser, and the artist had never seen it again. According to the artist, according to U.S. libel law, I had, that was, it's in good faith to quote somebody saying something is not libel anyway, which I knew. But he claimed he had never met the artist, so I just went to the museum library and photocopied lots of documentation of their collaborations and conversations and basically hurled it at the editor who didn't believe me, who of course never apologized, but decided maybe we just shouldn't burn all my books. And a horrible old man who took lots of kind of grisly photographs of himself naked. He became quite famous for, but that's another story. Nothing against aging bodies, just against this asshole. But I think it was, and it was a very particular story. I think every woman struggles to have a voice to say, I'm competent, I'm sane, I'm rational, I'm capable of bearing witness to my own experience. I deserve to be listened to. Mm-hmm. And when you're trying to become a writer, you're making a very specific claim to the right, to be listened to and the value of what you have to say. And so those two things very much play against each other and mix up in this story. And and of course, I've ended up back having lots of room and being able to say things in translation in Turkish and Korean and things like that, which to my amazement and delight, so I feel like I've won to some extent. And of course, what do you do if you come from voicelessness to have a voice, and you try and use it to open up space, to amplify other voices, to open up space for other people to have voices, to use it for justice and for that kind of expansion. And mm-hmm. So I've been trying to do that.
And it's very unusual to read a kind of account, a history of those kind of, both the sort of day-to-day violences and assaults of just being a woman, but also because one of your subjects was gender-based violence, you were obviously consuming huge amounts of this information. And you write in this book about the kind of impact of that upon you. And I think in some ways the most kind of powerful, gut-wrenching sentence of this book is, it gets you even if it doesn't get you. And I think when I read that, I sort of realized that I think so many women, we don't even give ourselves permission, really, to feel really scared about that feeling of when it does happen to a woman, when a woman is murdered or raped, that there is a part of us that goes, it could have been me. And it does kill a part of us. And again, it sort of goes back to that sort of spectrum idea that you explore in Men Explain Things to Me, that okay, it may be a microaggression, but at the other end of the spectrum is annihilation.
Yeah. No, Men Explain Things begins with this very, amusing anecdote in which a man tells me about the very important book I should read, which, as it happens, I had written, and is too busy kind of waltzing to the music of his own voice to even let my friend interject that my friend Sally kept saying that's her book. And I actually sat down in 2008 to write the essay thinking that Men Explaining Things to Me was going to be a fairly, kind of amused essay. And then immediately, because you sort of have to have some sort of blueprint for longer works. I was talking to a friend about this, but you also have to let the epiphanies and surprises happen in the process. And very quickly I was writing another story about a woman rushing naked out of her house in a very wealthy community, actually of nuclear physicists making bombs, but rushing naked out of her house in the middle of the night, screaming that her husband was trying to kill her. And the man who told me this story was chuckling because he assumed that she was crazy because he could not conceive that she was actually telling the truth, that the categories in which his patriarchal imagination existed, upper middle class white men do not kill their wives or attempt to kill their wives, but women, bitches be crazy, was totally his mindset. But yet, and part of why I wanted to write about my own experience of violence is because it's extremely ordinary. Mm-hmm. I've not actually been raped, although there's been various attempts, and I've been stalked and threatened with death, among other things, and harassed, and, all kinds of grabbed and groped, and, But there's often a sense in the ways that some of the memoirs, there's been some memoirs by people who had really extreme things happen to them, and it's not their fault, but the conversation is either like this very specific physical bad thing happened to you or nothing happened to you. But all of us who are female presenting, but it also happens to men and boys and children, and even non-binary people, but women and girls in particular live in a world where large numbers, of men want to harm you. And even if nothing actually happens to you, you spend your whole life navigating the fact that people want to humiliate you, to violate you, to invade you, to destroy you psychically and maybe literally by murdering you, sometimes by kidnapping, torturing you for extended periods, and then dismembering you. It's really fucking grisly. And just to live in a world where that, it could have been me. And, the 1980s and 70s and 80s when I grew up in America were really, in some ways, the most violent era in the country's history, and nobody wanted to talk about it. Feminism was still opening up a space to talk about it. I feel like one of the great triumphs of feminism in the last 10 years, since Jyoti Singh was murdered in New Delhi, raped, disemboweled, tortured, murdered in New Delhi, and the Steubenville rape case and campus rape activism in the U.S., space has been opened up to talk about how we live in a world of ambient violence and it affects all of us. But so I wanted to talk about my very quotidian experience because I didn't feel that people were really talking about that enough. Just okay, I'm leaving this place after dark. What's my route home? What will I do if, or like, what is this person sitting next to me trying to do? Is he going to follow me off the bus? Is this coworker a creep? Does this person know where I live? If I say this thing on social media, will I get doxxed? We constantly are making educated guesses about what will cause harm to us because we live in a world in which that harm is so normalized and ordinary and prevalent. And one of my big jobs, not my most cheerful job, has been to just try and make the outrageousness of it, that to try and make something that's been so accepted and invisible, visible and unacceptable, which I think is so often a huge part of human rights work. And so that is a job I've been doing since I published my first essay on violence against women in 1985. And it's been exciting because I felt like a voice crying out in the wilderness to see a really great intersectional feminist movement do so much in the last decade to change it, and with practical consequences in law and culture and conversation and and representational differences, which one of the great measures of which I think a lot of some of you look like you might even be almost as old as me out there in that audience. That really interesting experience we'll have where we go watch a movie, listen to a song, read a book we thought we really liked 20, 30 years ago, and find that there's some kind of mean-spiritedness, cruelty, discrimination, homophobia, misogyny, body shaming, mockery of disability, etc., that was very normal, and you just had no sense of humor if you didn't go along with the joke, was the rule in those days. To find that we no longer accept things that were almost so acceptable they're almost invisible to us is one of the really interesting things happening in this decade, which is how we know that the world has changed. And it's actually very exciting for me to be like, wow, we now have the ability to see this, to reject it, to ask everyone to do better than that. And, so I'm actually, even though I talk about violence against women a lot, I'm hopeful because it has changed so much in my lifetime.
Yeah, well, and it's thanks to you for making the invisible visible for so long. And by the end of Recollections, you've emerged as a political writer who, you talk about yourself as often being motivated by the very worst of things, everything that you were just talking about there, Rebecca, but also that you write about what you love. And that seemed to me, when I read that sentence and then I started reading Orwell's Roses, it was like the perfect segue into Orwell's Roses, which is also about a writer who was motivated as much by what he loved as what he loathed. Fascism, totalitarianism. And this is a kind of resurrection of Orwell, the lover, the lover of life. And so I thought perhaps we could start there. Why you wanted to sort of take that project on, and what you saw when you saw this writer planting roses in his garden in Wallington, which is near Cambridge, at this particular point, 1936. Why this image arrested you and led to a book?
It was the actual roses. So for the sake of my friend Sam, who thought he might do a documentary about trees, one day when he's a filmmaker, and we were talking about trees. He was interested in trees planted by notable people. I mentioned that Orwell had planted fruit trees, and Sam got very excited. I dashed to my computer to see if we could figure out where. It was the first time I really paid attention to Wallington. I knew Orwell's work really well, and this was in an essay I'd been reading since I was maybe in my very early 20s, called A Good Word for the Vicar of Bray, where he talks about in 1936 planting roses, fruit trees, etc., and coming back 10 years later to see that they're still flourishing, and saying that, and although it's not true in Orwell's case, that the planting of a tree, particularly a long-lived hardwood tree like a walnut, may outlive everything else you've ever done. It's this very kind of pastoral, joyous, pleasurable essay in which he's clearly having a really good time thinking about very pleasant things. And I always thought of it as an outlier from who Orwell really was. But the thing about this book is, in some ways, Orwell is a pretext. So I went to Wallington on Sam's behalf to look for fruit trees and found roses instead on my behalf. The fruit trees had been cut down. The lovely people who live in the cottage invited me in. We hung out. I had a cup of tea while the taxi meter was running. And, I would have willingly let the meter run for up to thousands of pounds, because what I was about to find was so incredibly valuable to me in every possible way. So a good while after we'd started hanging out, they said, well, the fruit trees have been cut down, but would you like to see the roses he planted? It's like, oh my God, what kind, like, that's the best question I've ever been asked. It goes right up there with, like, if you want it, you should have it. And it was really, and so the sense in which Orwell is a pretext is that I think in the culture at large, and in the left particularly, there's a lot of Puritanism in a lot of ways, and and a lot of kind of excluding nature as a significant pleasure and joy and beauty from as serious political subjects. In one sense, we often treat the things that we do that give us joy as trivial, superfluous, unnecessary, irrelevant, self-indulgent, etc. But what's really interesting, and this is true of many writers, but and ultimately I think of everybody, is that there's things you need to do that nobody should fucking judge, that may be necessary. And Orwell wrote some of the greatest work of the 20th century against fascism, totalitarianism, propaganda, and lies. How did he do it? Well, obviously he wrote what it made it possible for him to write. Well, all these other things that he may have needed to do. And I think a lot of us, we need to do these other things. There's a wonderful essay by my friend Lawrence Weschler, I quote, where he goes to hear the War Crimes Tribunal for the Yugoslav war crimes in the 1990s, and asks the judge in The Hague how he can stand to listen to these stories of torture, rape, and murder day after day. And the judge pauses for a moment, and then his face brightens. He says, oh, after work I go to, I forget the museum, and look at the Vermeers. And so it's like, oh, looking at Vermeer makes it possible to, be a judge addressing, human rights and war crimes. And which is, that maybe these pictures that are obviously not immediately topical and political give somebody the space in which to be the person who can go do these things. So, and there's a wonderful phrase I came upon researching this book, which everybody knows, and I had known most of my life, but didn't really understand. Bread and Roses, actually coined by a woman suffragist organizing when women were getting the vote state by state in the U.S. before in 1920, when I suppose they want to overturn that now too, since the founding fathers didn't grant it in the 18th century. And essentially they're saying anything not specifically given by the founding fathers cannot be assumed to be a right. And, I'm kind of wondering, like, well, maybe slavery is okay now. Tell us, guys.
Yeah.
But I digress. So this wonderful woman on lecture tour in 1910 gave a talk about how when women gained the right to vote, she was perhaps a little optimistic, they would vote for bread but roses too. And there's this wonderful moment when feminism and socialism were very much united in their vision of social justice. and bread for all and flowers too, which she said in this speech, which then became Bread and Roses and the subject of James Oppenheimer's poem, which became the song, which Mimi Farina and Joan Baez would sing, and so forth and so on. But what the phrase really meant is that, yes, we fight for what all socialism fights for, which is bread, which is the practical, physical bread, food, clothing, shelter that everybody needs for basic bodily survival. But roses were being demanded by both labor and suffragists as equally important, and roses meant nature, culture, pleasure, leisure, all these intangible things. And it was this wonderful defense of the incalculable, the subjective, the personal, all these things that you can't mete out. And a totalitarian regime can feed everybody and give everybody shelter, but it's not necessarily going to let you decide what your roses are going to be. It'll be like, you can listen to this state-sponsored poet, but we'll put these other poets in the gulags, or imprison you for selling 1984, which is happening in Russia now. So Bread and Roses is actually a radical claim about human nature, that we are a much more complex, subtle, varied creature than bread alone accounts for. We need roses too. So it's this beautifully radical political statement. And when I got to know Orwell all over again after I met his Roses, I found that essentially he was a champion of Bread and Roses too. Everybody knows what Orwell was against, Big Brother, totalitarianism, Stalin, Hitler, etc. But the wonderful thing Dorian Lynskey said about this book is it's about what Orwell was for. And I think that's another thing I was interested in writing the book. I think people who become so locked onto what they oppose that they forget what they're for often their imagination shuts down, they become embittered, they become the dysfunctional people and the puritanical people in our political movements. Even now, I would say, what are we in the U.S. feeling in this moment? And of course, anger and at the Supreme Court, and the misogynist would be one thing. But where does that really come from? And I think it's actually a love of justice, a love of human rights, a love of women's right to sovereignty. I think most real political commitment is motivated by love. And Orwell loved a lot of things. He loved flowers, he loved gardening, he loved the natural world. He loved observing the seasons and the weather and kind of rambling around in the countryside. And he loved a lot of things. And when I went back to his work, the real shock is how much pleasure, joy, and beauty was in his work, and how often he became an ardent defender of those things all the way through 1984. There's this anonymous woman I'm eternally grateful to who wrote to him when he wrote for the socialist magazine Tribune that, this kind of very harsh letter apparently, where she told him that that flowers are bourgeois. And I utterly love that, because it's so much what the left is always telling us, that, nobody should have anything until everybody has everything, which is a permanent delay, because nobody will ever have everything. We will never achieve utopia. And if you're not allowed to have anything pretty or take any time off or smell the roses until then you're just not allowed, period. And, and they kind of hand it down from on high. And so this woman, and flowers are bourgeois, and flowers have existed for millions of years, tens of millions of years before human beings existed, which means they definitely existed before the bourgeoisie existed. Without flowering plants literally made this earth. They, are the dominant. I'm not a good enough scientist to know where we are in the kingdom, genus, species of it, but flowering plants are the dominant life form on Earth. Much more than animals, plants made this earth from the beginning in the ocean to the formation of soils, etc. Almost everything we eat except fish, seaweed and mushrooms, is either flowering plants or something that fed on flowering plants. And but I don't want to defend flowers because they're utilitarian. And one of the things, that was a question for me, like, okay, Orwell loved gardening and was an ardent vegetable gardener, said in a 1940 questionnaire that after my writing, the most important thing to me, or the thing I care about most, is gardening, particularly vegetable gardening, a subtle clue about the size of a blue whale. And but But he also kept planting flowers everywhere he went and asked that flowers be planted on his own grave, which I'll be visiting with the Orwell Society on Sunday. Last time I was there, was a straggly red rose growing on it. Planted flowers on his wife's grave, planted flowers, including roses, on the Isle of Jura when he moved there in 1946 to kind of lead live his dream of living on a remote island. Planted roses in 1936 in this remarkable moment between reporting on the brutal conditions of the unemployed and the workers and families in the mining districts around Manchester. That became his, first really explicitly political book, The Road to Wigan Pier, and then went to Spain to fight for democracy and against fascism, and what would produce the book Homage to Catalonia. So between these two moments of deep political engagement that would absolutely form him, he moves, he rents this cottage his aunt had found in Wallington, which was also partly just the cheapest place this very struggling writer could find, but begins to lead for the first time the life he really wanted, to be rural, to have the kind of garden he wanted, to make a living as a writer. And then the wonderful Eileen O'Shaughnessy would join him. There's a wonderful argument that his writing gets better, smarter, deeper, partly because this really brilliant woman has come and joined him. And but he marries her, begins planting the garden in April, marries her in June, lives there until he goes to Spain in December. But so these three things in this 1 year, really seeing a kind of bleakness he's never quite seen before. And he writes beautifully about the coal mining, this kind of horror of it, and this realization that all of Britain's puissance, its might, its global power at that moment, is all fueled by this utterly filthy poison that nobody is really looking at except the miners. Writes about how easy it is to not see it. It's in a strange way an environmental book. So he does, but it's, and in a strange way also a war book, because burning coal is kind of a war against the environment, but forcing, the generations of working class people into the mines is a kind of war against them. And, just the brutality of it, the violence of it that he sees, the destructiveness of it. And then he goes off to this literal war in Spain and wakes up to what Stalinism is really about, as he realizes that the war is being corrupted, as the Stalinist aligned left is fighting against the non-aligned left. So it's a three-sided war, not just simple left and loyalists against fascism. But so Orwell was partly a pretext to think about these larger subjects, and also to look at somebody who did this remarkable thing, which is to sustain himself in a time of incredible difficulty, a time in which I think he's absolutely heroic. All his life he had terrible lungs. He'd been very ill intermittently, even as a child and a youth. By the time he's in his 30s, he's got tuberculosis, and he spends the last 15 years of his life kind of putting off dying and intermittently having lung hemorrhages, being in sanatoriums and hospitals, and then just valiant. And I think, like a lot of people for whom death is very present, he lives more vividly. A lot of us waste our lives because we think we're immortal, and we can put off doing what really matters and until the interminable later. But I thought that the way that he lived his life as somebody both deeply committed to the public good, to justice, to truth, and also somebody really committed to, his chickens, his goats, and his flowers, and his pleasures, was kind of exemplary. I think we're in an extraordinarily difficult period of climate chaos, authoritarianism, and a kind of rolling back of some of the great achievements that we have around human rights as we see today, and that it demands a lot of us, and to be sustainable, to not become those bitter people whose imaginations have been crushed by so kind of soaking in the ugliness of the world. Orwell really models for us how to sustain yourself, how to, as in that wonderful Black spiritual song, keep your eyes on the prize, and pace yourself. And so I wrote this book not as something as literal as a guidebook, but because I think that's one of the things that is exemplary about Orwell, is that he keeps doing these things that give him pleasure and joy, and then he becomes one of the 20th century's two or three great voices against fascism. You can have both. In fact, maybe you have to be both.
Well, that's it. It's almost a journey towards seeing it not as an incongruous act after all. That at first sight, because there's a huge difference, isn't there, to finding out that George Orwell planted cabbages than to finding out that George Orwell planted roses. And I love that you kind of make the journey towards these things. This was not an indulgence, a distraction from the very serious political work. It was part of it, and it nourished it, and it fed it. And as you say, when you talk in these beautiful chapters about looking into deep time, actually, it's not even just about the aesthetics and the beauty. They sustain us in the most kind of literal way, roses and plant life in general. So to me, this book, coming at this precise moment in time, the attempt to sort of realign those things, the writer Orwell and the roses he planted in 1936, when you point out landscape and politics were so divorced then, in a way that obviously they weren't really, but they were seen as being divorced from one another. And so you're kind of, sewing them back together at this particular moment in time. It struck me as a very kind of radical, climate conscious act.
It was also, how do you write about Orwell in a time of climate chaos? And of course, the struggle around the climate is also about lies and propaganda and the abuse of power, and essentially the kind of totalitarianism of a handful of very powerful, mostly white, mostly male people deciding to destroy the earth for short-term profit against the great majority who want to see us to do what the climate requires of us, which is a swift managed transition away from the age of fossil fuel. This is why I'm so excited about Scotland and its wind power. And California, like, I know you've had some wonderful days where Scotland is producing more electricity than it's using. And California just had two of those for the first time, where we hit almost 100% renewables, including hydropower, but it was very exciting. And but I wanted to write about that and really look at, I've been doing environmental work most of my adult life. And of course, nature and how we imagine it is deeply political, and it was in Orwell's time. It's always political. There's this famous poem by Bertolt Brecht where he says in 1939, to talk about trees in a time like this is almost a crime, because you think trees are where you spend your vacation or something. And of course, what is climate but a war against trees, which sequester 2/3 of the carbon we pump, the carbon dioxide we pump out. And in some sense, plants sequestered, pulled huge amounts of carbon out of the atmosphere and put them underground, put it underground where it belongs. Essentially, what's produced climate change is taking what the plants sequestered underground and throwing it back into the sky at this frantic rate. Tens of millions of years of fossil carbon back into the sky. And there's kind of dead things. But there's nature was so political in the 1930s, whether it was eugenics in the U.S. and Britain, and of course, in its extreme form in Hitler's Germany, the Soviet Union politicizing science as a kind of anti-Darwinism, and which is often described as though, we had true science in the West and they had bogus science in the Soviet Union. It's true they had bogus science, a kind of anti-Darwinism that believed in inheritance of acquired characteristics and a lot of other bullshit that often led to silencing, terrorizing, sending to gulags and prisons, or just murdering some of the best scientists in the Soviet Union. But part of what triggered the Soviet Union's anti-Darwinism was the fact that Darwin's own son, and a lot of the other sort of sons of the great scientists of the 19th century and a lot of other prominent scientists were literally in things like the British Eugenics Society. And if you wonder whether or not it's about eugenics, it's not that hard to tell. And, people were being sterilized into, I think, the 1970s in Canada and the US because they were considered to be kind of, genetically inferior as people with mental, with disabilities or people of color, you know, impoverished people, etc. And so it was deeply political in the management of nature. Orwell's father had been an opium agent. Plants which are a huge part of what we produce and consume. And the fossilized plants of fossil fuel that we fight wars over. They're tremendously political. So Orwell's father was an opium agent, brutally exploiting Indian farmers to force them to produce this crop to export to China, to try, to force on China for the British trade imbalance. Orwell's maternal grandfather was a teak merchant stealing teak from the Burmese to sell to the West. Orwell's, I think, great-great-grandfather and generations before that owned slaves to work sugar plantations in Jamaica. So, sugarcane, teak trees, opium poppies, botanical warfare, and biocolonialism. It's part of why Jamaica Kincaid has such a star turn in my book. She's the most beautiful and brilliant and scathing writer about flowers, gardens, racism, and colonialism.
Absolutely. I'm so glad that both her work and the sort of history of colonialism and everything plays such an important part in this book. And there is something of that reappraisal happening in this country at the moment, in terms of the way we look at our botanical gardens or the way the National Trust talks about its properties. That there is a kind of reckoning happening, however awkward and incomplete.
It was, yeah. I used slave registries that had been put online and some of the great writing about slavery funding a lot of the great country houses, insofar as they're great, large country houses, posh country houses of 18th and 19th century. And it was really interesting to see this stuff suddenly acknowledged, and very useful for this book.
We're slightly running out of time, but I wondered if we could maybe close on your rereading of 1984, because it's so moving. I think so many of us read 1984. I certainly know for myself, as a teenager, I was so taken with it that I copied the entire book out.
Literally?
Yeah.
Oh my God, do you still have it?
I know, I do not. And I don't think it would make as good reading as the actual manuscript. But, when you went back after however many rereadings of 1984 with this lens of, having been to Wallington and seen the roses and really, you dug deep into your territory, and then you reread this book and it's so moving, the final kind of paragraphs of this book, and what you found there. You even found a metaphor of a rose.
Yeah, and I had read 1984 many times over since I was a teenager. It's one of the wonderful things about getting older is that as you become a different person, as the conversations around you change, you go back to works of art. Okay, sometimes it's terrible, like watching 1980s rom-coms, but and finding out that they're full of rape jokes and harassment and homophobia and stuff. But sometimes it's wonderful. So rereading 1984 after, and I knew Orwell's work pretty well, but I didn't know his life, and so I read some biographies. But what really changed my understanding of him was reading his own letters and diaries and finding something really different, and then reading the published work again. And 1984 in particular is a really lush, strange book, not at all like I remembered. I think for all of us, because the stuff about the regime and the intimate terror it inflicts on everybody and that profound control, a bit like China nowadays, is so intense. It's what's really memorable. But how does Winston Smith, his protagonist, resist it? By pursuing beauty, pleasure, joy, passion, romance, love, memory, and the capacity of his own mind to determine reality. And one of the things that's been really interesting to me in recent years is realizing that feminism trumped Orwell, etc., one of the things they've all taught me is that tyrants want to control facts, truth, history itself, whether it's the tyrant of the household or the tyrant of the nation. And that was one of Orwell's big sites, which he was, feminism was not yet in the point where we'd apply it to family life and dating, but, relationships. But so Winston resists by pursuing his pleasure, his joy, his direct experience. And Orwell clearly sees, well, he says, often Orwell describes one of the principles of Ingsoc, of Big Brother, and then shows, by example, Winston resisting it. For example, Orwell writes, "But the final command of the regime was to not trust the evidence of your own eyes and ears." I'm getting that slightly wrong, but that's the gist of it. And then Winston starts to think water is wet, stones are hard, objects dropped fall towards the center of the earth. And he's constantly trying to establish this capacity to have consciousness, to have intelligence, to have perception, to have memory that's independent. He's also having a passionate love affair which violates, the precepts. But the very first thing, the opening of the book, first that describes the bleakness of the London he lives in, but then he pulls out something that's opposite of bleak, an old book whose beauty is described so vividly. And then there's a kind of deep pleasure in the act of taking out an old style pen and inkwell and writing, both the intellectual pleasure of writing your thoughts, maybe communicating to the future, and just the sensuality of this beautiful creamy paper. I think you have to be a book lover to love paper the way that Orwell and Winston clearly do. And then all through there's all these lush, pleasurable moments. And for me, the climax of the book is not that Winston gets destroyed in the end, and his victory is temporary, but Margaret Atwood, a very topical person for today, points out that the appendix to 1984, which she imitates in The Handmaid's Tale, makes it clear that it's written after the regime has somehow ended, collapsed, whatever. So for me, the climax isn't that Winston's victories are temporary and then he's tortured into obedience and a kind of dumb, mute, mindlessness and the ability to think whatever he's supposed to think, and the inability to resist. But before that, he does rebel. But Winston himself is constantly saying, if there's hope, it lies with the proles. And he's not a prole. He's a white-collar, kind of middle-class guy in the party, as, the sort of more high-status people were in the Communist Party in Russia. And so with Julia, his lover, they find this love nest in a junk shop in the proletarian district. And the 3 times they describe going there, he sees and hears out the window a stout, middle-aged proletarian woman singing in a beautiful contralto voice, a kind of what he describes as just like a kind of rubbishy song, but the beauty of it, which clearly ties back to the beauty of the bird he hears singing in the Golden Country, the rural place he goes to once in the book, this place he's dreamed of. So she's singing and she's hanging out diapers. The song is about lost love. So she's remembering the past, which is a form of resistance. Hanging out the diapers is that she's somehow taking care of the future. And he thinks it's an extraordinary thing. He thinks that she could have been there for 1,000 years. She seems immortal, eternal, and she's clearly like this kind of chthonic earth goddess, this incredibly powerful figure. And then just before the thought police break in, the 3rd time he sees and hears her, he thinks that she's beautiful. I think for any man to see a stout middle-aged woman as beautiful is already revolutionary. So of course I was not, I was a lot thinner and younger some of the other times I read the book. But but what's remarkable about it is Winston seems to think in a metaphor. He sees her as beautiful, and he says when she was young, she must have been like a rose, sort of tender and blooming, and now she's like the rosehip. And then he thinks, why should the fruit be held inferior to the flower? And one of the things I love about it is that Orwell's, flowers are bourgeois, but the handiness of a metaphor of a flower allows Orwell to write this book against totalitarianism and for our capacity to think, perceive, love, etc. Just as browsing in junk shops, he discovered the glass paperweight with a bit of coral in it that's also one of the key symbols. And you can see that kind of chastising Puritan leftist saying, you're wasting your time browsing in junk shops when you should be, I don't know, grinding out propaganda for the cause. But he finds a symbol for a book that, somebody was arrested for in Belarus and somebody else in Russia, this year for. So, these things are wonderful. I will end because I think we're supposed to end now. A wonderful environmentalist friend of mine, Chip Ward, a former librarian and or retired librarian, librarians being our best people, and an environmentalist, they being our other best people. So he is the best possible person. Coined a phrase many years ago that I use constantly with credit, the tyranny of the quantifiable. And one of the beautiful things about Orwell is that among the many tyrannies he's fighting against is the tyranny of the quantifiable, which tries to defend our bread but take away our roses. And so, the roses are part of the overcoming that tyranny of the quantifiable in favor of this kind of broader, deeper, more poetic, more subjective, more inclusive thing. And I think a lot of people are doing beautiful versions of that now, including black women like Adrienne Marie Brown in the US, queer people, etc. But I thought Orwell was unassailable, and the fact that he makes this argument helps make it for all of us. So may you all have bread, but also roses, and thank you so much.
Thank you, Rebecca Solnit. Thank you so much. We have grossly run over, but if Rebecca Solnit can't break the rules, who can, frankly? Thank you so much for coming. Honestly, these books are both so wonderful. I feel like you've planted two roses with both of these books. And Rebecca's signed lots of copies of these two books and some of her back catalogue too, and so you can all go out and buy lots of her books now. Thank you so much for being such a wonderful audience, and thank you once again to Rebecca. Why not?
Thank you so much, Chitra. Thank you, Portobello Books. Thank you, Proof and Granta, without which this book would not be here. And thank you, you absolutely amazing people out there who want to think about all these things, which is so much part of the work. So, thank you. And now we slip off stage and...